over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. The drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer. Send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there.
Oyez. The Honorable, the Supreme Court of Texas. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of Texas, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the state of Texas, this honorable court.
Please remain standing while the colors are presented. Thank the Honor Guard, which comes to us courtesy of the historic 36th Infantry Division, also known as the Arrowhead Division or the T-Patchers, because it's a Texas division. It is based at Camp Mabry, and which you will soon learn was one of the elite military units that produced several of the Texas Supreme Court justices and others that are being honored here today. The Honor Guard consists of Sergeant First Class Jose Alvarado, Staff Sergeant Terry Bailey, and Sergeant Hugo Luna. And the national anthem was beautifully sung by Sergeant Melissa Bosky. And the Honor Guard detail was specifically constituted for this event by Master Sergeant Michael Leslie. We want to thank them for being here. There are a whole lot of people that I need to thank and recognize, and so we'll get started here real quickly. We want to thank Allie James from the Texas Preservation Board, and I don't know whether Allie is here, maybe not, and also Robert Davis, the Capital Scheduling Planner, for their assistance in securing this beautiful historic courtroom for this event. Also thanks go to State Librarian Mark Smith, State Architect Jelaine Chubb, and Jeff Fisher, Texas Military Forces Museum Director, for their assistance in loaning archival materials in connection with this event, which you'll get to see a little bit later. Welcome to this special session of the Supreme Court of Texas. As you probably have noticed by now, Chief Justice Nathan Hecht is unable to be here, along with Justices Phil Johnson and Deborah Lehrman, but they send along their sincere regrets and assurance that their absence in no way signifies any lack of interest or appreciation for this event. I am Justice Paul Green. To my right, below me here, is Justice Eva Guzman. To my left is Justice Jeff Boyd. And to Justice Guzman's right is Justice John Devine. And Justice Boyd's left is Justice Jeff Brown. And finally, to Justice Brown's left is Justice Jimmy Blacklock. Also from the court, we have Blake Hawthorne, the clerk of the court, and Linda Smith is here assisting, my executive assistant. There are a few special guests and dignitaries in attendance. I think they're in attendance, we'll see, who should be recognized. From our sister court, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, I haven't seen Presiding Judge Keller. Is she not here? Okay. Judges Mike Kiesler is there in the back. Burt Richardson, Kevin Urey, I don't see, there's Kevin. Mary Lou Keel, she's not here, and Scott Walker. There's Judge Walker. Also from that court, Deanna Williamson, the court clerk. Is she here? Yes. Also notice that the former Supreme Court Justice's Chief Justice Wallace Jefferson is here. Former Justice Dale Wainwright and former Justice Craig Enoch are here. And Joe Longley, State Bar President, is here. Thank you, Joe. Trey Apple, Executive Director of the Bar, is here. And Sharon Sandel of the Bar as well. Marcy Greer, President of the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society, is here. And she will introduce individuals from the society as we move through the program. I also want to mention I saw former Representative Dan Branch sitting in the back. You can see Dan. Anyone else that needs to be recognized or wants to be recognized that I've missed? Oh, yeah. Justice Ken Wise and Jane Bland are here. Yes, thank you very much for them being here, too. I'm sorry? Russell? Oh, Justice Russell Lloyd, where are you? Oh, there you are. Yes, of course. When the Great War broke out in Europe in 1914, most of the United States regarded it as little more than a regional conflict. It was over there. Later, when Germany began its unrestricted submarine warfare against all Allied powers, including the United States, Americans began to take notice. American lives were being lost and U.S. interests were being affected. Consequently, the United States was ultimately drawn into a world war. When the war against the Central Powers was declared in 1917, American military strength was at a low ebb. But as our enemies would soon find out, and would find out again 25 years later, the sleeping giant had an enormous capacity to prepare for war when necessary. An army was quickly assembled and was sent to war overseas. Citizens became soldiers and fought with distinction and honor until the armistice was declared on the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, exactly 100 years ago this past Sunday. These citizen soldiers then returned home and went back to work. Some of them entered the legal profession, like my grandfather, who served overseas in the Army Signal Corps. The Texas Supreme Court Historical Society has done a remarkable job of tracking several World War I military veterans who came home to serve again, this time as civilians in public service, some even in the judiciary. We honor them today. I now call upon Society President Marcy Greer to open the program. President Greer.
Thank you so much, Justice Green, and thank you all for being here. We're very excited about this program. When it first came together, we thought it would be a remarkable way to honor the justices who fought in World War I, and then we expanded it when we found out that there were 3 governors as well who had fought in the Great War, a rich part of our history, and we're thrilled to be able to honor it today. The Society protects, preserves, teaches, and disseminates Texas judges' history, the judiciary, the rule of law, all the things that happen to make this state great. And we're proud of that role. We have an impressive collection of books. Our goal is to make this part of Texas history, which is so rich and so wonderful, accessible and understandable, and tell the stories in a way that will resonate to lawyers, practitioners, judges, and even elementary and high school and middle school students, because this is an important part of our culture. We have a number of trustees in the room who serve on our board and run the society and come up with great ideas. Would the trustees please stand and be recognized? I'm delighted to introduce the Great War Committee Chair, Judge Mark Davidson, who came up with the wonderful idea of our program today, and David Furlow, the other co-chair who has made this program possible. If you would please come.
May it please the court. 100 years ago today, the cannons were cooling down, but they weren't cold yet because they'd been fired for 4 straight years. An artillery captain who would later become a renowned Houston attorney would order his men to shoot a barrage at the German lines at 10:59 on the morning of the armistice. 2 minutes later, soldiers from both sides were coming across the line, going into what had been called no man's land, to shake hands and hug their former adversaries. The wounded and the sick, who were the majority of those that were there, all heaved a sigh of relief. They had lived. They had survived. And if you look at their letters home, you will realize the relief that they felt on the 12th and 13th of November. They were looking forward to medical treatment, to warm showers, to clean clothes, and in time, to a boat ride home. But the armies would leave so much lead in the ground that to this day, 100 years later, there are fields that anything that's grown there still has lead poisoning in it. And it's inedible. Since 2014, the countries in Europe have been noting the passage of the centennial of the war and its developments. They call it the Great War. We commonly call it World War I. In America, remembrance of the war has largely been muted because unlike our friends and our former enemies across the pond, the war is largely forgotten in our history classes and popular culture. Example, Generals Patton, Eisenhower, MacArthur, and Admiral Nimitz have all been celebrated in documentaries. Everybody knows about those movies and documentaries. Other than General Pershing, how many people here can name one general that fought in Europe during the war? Be quiet, David. Very good. Thank you, Russell. And I would expect, frankly, you could probably name more than 10. I know you. Generals Pershing, Tasker Bliss, and their contemporaries have not been accorded those privileges and that recognition. But given the fact that the Great War has been all but forgotten in popular culture, it's fair for us to ask at the beginning today, why does it matter? Why are we even here today? Well, here are 3 reasons. First, this is a day of significance for both our nation and our state. The 100th anniversary of the beginning of the war is the beginning of the American century. The 19th century and the first 14 years of the 20th century were a European century. Through indoctrination, through diplomacy, through military conquest and imperialism, the old world largely took over the so-called Third World and treated them as colonies. The deaths of an entire generation of young European men in the war and the mammoth financial costs left a vacuum that was filled by the United States of America, because we had stayed out of the war until the last year and a half. The United States found itself financially and militarily powerful after the war. America had suffered casualties, to be sure, but they were a fraction of the casualties, or so we thought, and we had spent much less of our resources in the war. This led to our economy leading the world in the next 100 years, a state that would be enhanced by our late entry into World War II. Our nation's role as a world leader, therefore, began 100 years ago this week. The Great War was the first war in which the use of, and therefore access to, petroleum was critical to long-term success. No state in America produced then, or produces now, more oil than Texas. The war turned us from an agricultural backwater to a major player in American and the world economy. The second reason today matters is that the cauldron of military service in times of war creates leaders who have answered and will continue to answer the call of duty to our nation's country, to our nation. That is proven by the quality of the justices and the governors who we honor today. Whether their service was as an officer in the front line of battle, a quartermaster corps member providing arms and food, or those soldiers and sailors who were on their way over there at the time of the armistice, men you hear about today were all proven leaders of at young ages. Among the American soldiers and sailors that would celebrate the day of the armistice were 7 young men who would serve on this court. 3 more would become governor of Texas, and 2 would sit on the Court of Criminal Appeals. You will hear of each today. For the last 3 generations, the last 3 decades, we have celebrated the accomplishments of the greatest generation, the men and women who came of age during the 1940s. And they're entitled to praise. But in praising them, we have failed to recognize our debt to their predecessors of the generation before. When you hear about the lives and the service to our state of the judges and governors we often honor here today, consider how their service made this court and our state better. Countless veterans would become public servants in various capacities all over our state and nation, and each of the 11 veterans we honor today made a difference for our state and one for the better. The third reason this day is significant is that each of these men and each of the millions of American men and women who answered the call of service to our nation deserve our thanks and praise for what they did. And what they did has largely been forgotten in the last 50 years. Each of them served at a time in which the technology of weapons had advanced far more than had developments in medicine, sanitation, and the prevention of disease. Their sacrifices during the war did not make it the war to end all wars, but it was the first step in ridding the world of colonialism, dictatorship, and helped us evolve into a world that, for the most part, honors democracy and cares about human rights. On the centennial, therefore, of the conclusion of the war, we should and are pausing to thank each of the members of the generation that served, for this may be the last time that any ceremony is made honoring some of the people we honor today. Last month, I was watching a college football game that was taking place in a stadium about a mile north of here. Perhaps some of you have been there before. The television announcer breathlessly said that the game was being played at Darrell K. Royal Memorial Stadium, honoring the legendary Texas football coach. I'm not denigrating Coach Royal, who was a great coach and a greater gentleman. However, the word memorial in that stadium does not refer to the life of Darrell Royal. The word memorial in that stadium, which was built in 1924, was built to honor the UT students and UT alumni that died in that war. You should see the letter I sent to Fox Sports. Therefore, the next time you go into the stadium, please remember what the original intent of the word memorial was. When you do so, I would suggest that a great way to honor the real purpose of that name is when you enter the stadium, instead of saying hook 'em horns, say freedom forever. In Justice Johnson's case, were he here, I'd say, or Reckham Tech. Today we honor a forgotten war and judges whose works appear in cases that are seldom cited. But we owe each of them a great deal of thanks for all their service to us. And that is the greatest and the best reason that this day matters. The soldiers and sailors of the Great War are no longer with us, but their courage, their sacrifice, and their deaths should not be forgotten. We're here today to remember them and to give them thanks. This court is due praise today for meeting to thank them. And you all honor the history of this court and everybody that fought in that war by your presence here today. That's why this matters. Thank you.
And I thank this court and the Supreme Court Historical Society, our president, Marcy Hogan Greer, our executive director, Sharon Sandel, and our hardworking David Kroll, our graphics editor, and Marilyn Duncan, our written editor, for their immense amount of work and contribution to this special issue of the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society that we present to the justices of the Texas Supreme Court and to our friends on the Court of Criminal Appeals to honor and commemorate those former justices and those former governors of this state who put their lives at risk to serve their country and to make the world safer for democracy. Those are the people that we honor here today, and their descendants in the first row who will come up and speak a few words to share with you, in one instance, the actual words of one of those justices we commemorate now. Let me actually take you then through the story of important lives measured and tempered by war, who then returned to America and made sure that, as opposed to fascist Italy or Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or Central Europe, which fell away from the rule of law, they came here to courts like this one and the Court of Criminal Appeals and the Governor's Office to ensure that the rule of law would continue in this democracy that is indeed the last best hope for democracy on earth. We will honor these men, as well as the women who, in 7 instances, the nurses from Texas who gave their lives in the trenches and the front lines of the First World War. The 8 justices of the Supreme Court are Few Brewster, Frank Culver Jr., A.J. Foley, Wilmer St. John Garwood, Meade F. Griffin, Robert W. Hamilton, Gordon Simpson, and Charles Slatton. But Meade F. Griffin counts as a special category because he also served 1 year on the Court of Criminal Appeals, and that is a special circumstance and a measure of the confidence that the leaders of this state had in him. Also, George Christian, a heroic servant of the people of Texas who served on the Commission of the Court of Criminal Appeals. So we counted him as a Court of Criminal Appeals judge for this great war commemoration so that his service would not be forgotten. And in addition, 3 Texas governors, Dan Moody, James V. Jimmy Allred, and Beaufort Jester, all of whom put their lives at risk for their country. In this issue of the Journal, I would suggest that if you begin from the beginning, you will see Sharon Sandal's wonderful article on the way that the war affected women, and those women who in 7 instances gave their lives as Gold Star nurses in order to bring health and safety and a measure of peace to those soldiers who were on the front lines by putting themselves on the front lines and at risk. And then you will read Justice Ken Wise's excellent article, Training the Soldier, that tells you about why Texas was a special place to train our airmen, our officers, our soldiers, and even cavalrymen like Garwood St. John, Wilmer St. John Garwood of Baker Botts. So let's go through these and actually look at their lives for a moment and consider what lives they left behind, what they faced on the front lines of the Western Front, and how they changed the world after they got back here. Here you see Few in his uniform from World War I days, and then here in Austin, in the Central Lozenge, as he sat for a portrait, still wearing his uniform after returning to Austin in 1919. And then years later, when the Texas Bar Journal commemorated his passing for all of the great accomplishments and services he had rendered the State Bar of Texas. Now, if we look at Few Brewster, who served from 1945 to 1957, he was drafted into the Army as a private first class in Temple. He was put into the 165th Development Brigade, training men for combat, and yet the skills he would learn there in terms of developing individuals for the future would apply equally well when he served on this court. A college graduate, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant, sent to Camp Pike, Arkansas for officer training, then took charge of Company F, 2nd Development Battalion in October of 1918 and was stationed in that cold, wintry clime of Camp Custer, Michigan, to train troops, which he did very well, earning his honorable discharge. Now, what lessons did he bring back? What boons did he bring from his experience to his native Texas? Training, organization, planning and preparing again. And those are the skills that he taught lawyers here as he proved to be a leader of the state bar. He practiced law in Temple until 1929, a county attorney, the Bell County, then district attorney, district judge, president of the State Bar of Texas, appointed to the Commission of Appeals in 1941. He joined the Texas Supreme Court when the voters of this state by constitutional amendment expanded the court to the present 9. So for that, we honor and thank Few Brewster for his services to the state and to this court. George Eastland Christian did not serve on the Texas Supreme Court, but on the Commission of Appeals. He enlisted in the 90th Infantry Division, trained at Camp Travis in 1917, graduated as a second lieutenant, First Officers Training Camp, the FOTC down in Leon Springs that Justice Ken Wise has written well about. Served in Company D, the 344th Machine Gun Battalion, the 179th Infantry Brigade, in the Saint-Mihiel salient battle, and then in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. General Pershing moved the 344th Machine Gun Battalion and First Lieutenant George Christian, who had been promoted on the battlefield, into Germany for occupation duty at the end of 1918. To serve on the Western Front, in France and in Belgium, he first had to cross seas that were filled with the sharks, the steel sharks of the time, the U-boats, that were hunting the convoys and hoping to sink convoys filled with American troops to keep them from getting to Europe, to keep them from saving our allies, Britain and France. By the time it came for him to face battle, it was time. The German tide had been stopped, but it had to be turned back. And so at Saint-Mihiel in September of 1918, George Christian did his duty with his training as a machine gunner, facing poison gas. And you can see here in the clouds that when American troops would advance forward, they would be wearing gas masks as well as bayoneted rifles because of the prospect of the gas that could, upon being inhaled, turn into hydrochloric acid in the alveoli of their lungs that would blind them and send groups of troops, one man on another's shoulder, going back through the lines to seek medical treatment. And as if we need to know why there does need to be a red line between civilization and barbarism, and a strong stance taken whenever the prospect of poison gas weapons rear their ugly heads again in this part of the 21st century. What George Christian faced were gas mask-wearing German troops with Maxim machine guns ready to stop Americans, and so his team, or other teams like it here, firing a 37-millimeter machine gun cannon, had to go into battle to support the American troops moving forward to free Belgium and France from the Germans who had occupied those countries since 1914. The Kaiser had told the departing troops that they would be home before the leaves fell from the trees in 1914. Well, the winter of 1914 and 15 and 16 and 17 passed, and it finally took Americans to send them home after 4 years of the leaves falling from the trees because nothing else could do it at that point. Many of the men who fought with and beside George Christian now lie buried in those battlefields of Saint-Mihiel, here at Thiancourt, and over in the cemeteries of the Meuse-Argonne. So here we see him in his uniform, proud to serve his country, proud to be there with his family. The young George Christian, who risked his life for his country, and in post-war public service, continued to, with his honor, with his courage, with his energy, support the rule of law. 1919 to 1925, as in the years before he left the legal profession to become a soldier, he practiced law in Burnett, district attorney, for a number of counties. An assistant AG appointed by former Great War vet Dan Moody, the governor. And then when Governor Moody named him to the State Board of Pardon Advisors, and then appointed Christian to the Commission of the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, where he served until his death, serving his state as he had served his country. So here he is at the time with his colleagues, proud people who did their best to ensure that the rule of law that had been defended with blood and sweat and tears in the trenches of the Western Front would continue to serve the people of Texas in the 20th century. And there you see his tomb, where his grave marks his proud service for his country in the 344th Machine Gun Battalion, where he had risked his life on the front lines. We next move to Frank Culver. And in Frank, I feel a special connection. He served as second lieutenant, 1st in Battery E of the 345th Field Artillery Regiment in the 90th Division, one of the two Texas divisions, that and the 36th, whose men have come here, and men and women have come here for this service. He was later promoted 1st lieutenant. The Army gave him 155 millimeter howitzers and super heavy Holt gun tractors for Culver's brigade. He earned a promotion on the battlefield from 1st lieutenant to captain on October 10th, 1918, in the middle of the Meuse-Argonne campaign for leading the 3rd Battalion, 345th Field Artillery. And then he served in the 1918-1919 occupation of Germany. My grandfather served as a corporal in the same unit that Captain Culver commanded. And that brings to mind what T.S. Eliot observed, that our explorations never cease. And the end of all of our exploring is to come back to that place where we began and to know it for the first time. And that's how I felt here. And I therefore have a few slides from my own family history that would show you just what Culver's experience was like in that time. These are a few slides just from Wikipedia that showed the type of cannons, 155 millimeter cannons that Culver was in charge of commanding the men to operate. And there you see a German photograph of a shell burst at night and the sort of damage that all of these shells do to a landscape. It looks like something on the dark side of the moon. This is my own grandfather, and so this is the sort of uniform that men in Culver's command would have worn, here wearing the stripes of a corporal. He, of course, was a captain. That's from the same 345th Field Artillery. This is what I mean by, this was a combined Texas-Oklahoma operation. Here's a photograph that came from my own archives. German aerial bomb that didn't do its bit. Somebody was having a good laugh at taking an old-fashioned photograph of that. And then both of them did occupation duty in that stretch of the Rhineland that is known for having Peasport today, that wine from the Peasporter region. So thank you, Captain Culver, for the service that you rendered and for protecting my grandfather's life all those years ago. Post-war public service, private practice in Fort Worth through 1927, then as a prosecutor, 17th District Court judge. Recalled to active duty in World War II, he served as lieutenant colonel for the 45th Artillery Regiment, 90th Division. So back to the 90th Division, and let this be a warning that when the government wants to call you up to service, no robe will protect you from being called if the government wants you that badly. Second Court of Civil Appeals in Fort Worth, and elected to the Texas Supreme Court in 1952. There we have him with his colleagues in the new and expanded court of the 1950s. Frank B. Culver, 1953 to 1965. A.J. Foley, a young man here, but serious, and dressed by his parents with an effort to make him ready for the world to come. A serious young man who became a seriously influential and beneficial judge for the expertise he brought to this court in the late 1940s. He received a notice to appear for the draft, responded, became a private in the humble task of conservation and reclamation branch. He was doing repair work. But the repair work was important to making sure that our soldiers could go overseas fully equipped and fully ready to fight the Kaiser's Prussian military, defeat them, and liberate Europe. And that's what they did. Post-war public service, appointed to the Seventh Court of Civil Appeals in Amarillo in 1937. Supreme Court appointed him to serve on the Commission of Appeals in 43. The constitutional amendment the voters approved in 1945 took him from the Commission of Appeals to the Texas Supreme Court, where he became part of that coterie of comrades, that group of veterans who filled the court in the late 1940s. Wilmer St. John Garwood. Here is a man of privilege who recognized that those to whom much is given owe much in return. He rode into the First World War as a cavalryman stationed out west. He was prominent in the American Legion, setting up posts here in Texas, and then he ended his career as one of the great scholars of the Texas Supreme Court. Briefly, commissioned second lieutenant, then promoted to first lieutenant in the 1st Light Cavalry of the Texas National Guard, the 36th Infantry as it became. Redesignated the 36th Infantry at Camp Bowie in Tarrant County. The 36th Infantry participated in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, and he wanted to get there as quickly as he could, but was still training for the Western Front. When the armistice came, the Kaiser abdicated, the German government called a truce. Post-war, trial lawyer at Baker Botts, attorney for Standard Oil Company in Argentina, denied a commission in the Navy during World War II because he was too old. He signed up as a naval intelligence officer and won the Chilean Order of Merit for his service in defeating the Nazi and Japanese spies that were rife in South America at the time. Governor Beaufort Jester appointed him to the Texas Supreme Court. Meade Griffin, whose descendants fill this room here to this day, including Brian Garner, who will speak to you and will actually play the voice of one of these justices. Senior law class. These men left UT to join the first officers training camp at Leon Springs on May 8th, 1917. Because he had had some military training, the Army selected Griffin to serve as the cadet first sergeant of his training company, a band of brothers, and he was chosen as the oldest brother. His command of the 45th Company was so successful that the Army gave him a newly forming battalion and told him to train them for battle. He became a major and was ordered to report to Camp Sheridan in Montgomery, Alabama. There he is as a young man with his wife and infant son. Later, materials that ended up in Fewbrewster's scrapbook showed the roll call of those men who were looking back on their days in the first officers training camp, and this is in fact his medal that in a photograph that Brian Garner made available to me from the family archives of Meade Griffin. Meade Griffin exercised executive command over 5 battalions of soldiers at Fort Sheridan near Montgomery, Alabama, a substantial entrustment of responsibility, one that he fulfilled well. Here we see Justice Griffin during World War II. The man second from the right is Lewis Thomas, a close friend whose sons accompany Brian Garner to this great war commemoration here today. Post-war, the Army offered him a plum, regular commission as a captain. Like Cincinnatus returning to the fields, he turned down the Army career and went back to the fields of the law instead. He organized American legions in Tulia and Plainview. He returned as a lieutenant colonel and a chief prosecutor in a war crimes branch, putting his knowledge of military preparation to use in meting out justice to those who had violated the rules of law in Nazi Germany during the Second World War. Governor Jester appointed Griffin as an associate justice to this honorable court in 1949. Griffin served on the court from 1949 to 1968 and on the Court of Criminal Appeals in 1969. Many of you knew him, most from family, some from professional connections. It's time for us to honor him and thank him for his service. Robert Hamilton, 1959 to 1970. He's the student at UT. Robert Hamilton witnessed the birth of what we call today the Reserve Officer Training Corps, or ROTC. It was 1918, however, and this was the beginning of that process. The SATC, Student Army Training Corps. It arose from the National Defense Act of 1916, signed by President Wilson. It included 157 colleges and universities. It has now magnified many times over and provides half of the Reserve Army officers that now serve in our U.S. Army. Post-war, as public service, he taught school. He coached in Plainview to pay for law school. A judge for the 70th District in Midland, and then Chief Justice of the 8th Court of Appeals in El Paso. He campaigned to replace the retiring Justice Wilmer St. John Garwood, another of his colleagues in that band of brothers from the First World War. Won election to the Supreme Court and served so well that he won an uncontested election in 1964. We thank you for your service. Gordon Simpson, 1945 to 1949, reported at Camp Leon Springs, west of San Antonio, 1917, First Officers Training Camp. Within 3 months of starting training, he earned an appointment to serve as a U.S. Army Second Lieutenant in the Quartermaster Corps in charge of provisioning. An army marches on its belly. If well fed, it can march to the ends of the earth. He made sure that it was well fed. The Army promoted him to First Lieutenant on August 21, 1918. To quote John Milton, they also serve who stand and wait. Yes, and even those who wait on others. And then we have Gordon as a young man. Gordon Simpson, when he was running for a position in the Texas Supreme Court while serving in the Judge Advocate General program abroad in Italy, and Gordon Simpson in the last years of his life. Post-war public service, won 2 elections to the Texas House and served from 1923 to 27. This was a rich life. Governor Moody appointed him to the 7th District Court. He did so well there that amongst his peers, he was elected president of the State Bar from 1941 to 43. Re-enlisted in the Army in World War II as a major in the JAG Corps, although you can imagine he was well past the draft age. He did this because he would serve his country. Defeated incumbent Texas Supreme Court Justice Richard Kreitz, or Kritz, depending upon whether you're campaigning against him, will determine the pronunciation, while campaigning against the Germans in Italy. In the same campaign my father was, so I again relate personally to this justice. And then he served on the Dachau War Crimes Tribunal after World War II. If you're familiar with that story about the SS guards mowing down American prisoners of war at Malmedy, he was one of the justices who was presiding over that trial to bring justice to those who would gun down defenseless American prisoners of war. Charles Slatton, and this is the last of our judges here. Charles was a corporal with Company E in the headquarters and supply detachment of the 51st Telegram Battalion, U.S. Army Signal Corps' 3rd Army during World War I. What does that mean? Command, communications, and control. The way you move a modern army to victory is by remaining in contact with them, giving them orders, learning what conditions are like at the front, reacting to opportunities, avoiding dangers. This is what Charles Slatton did. His obituary states that he and his brother twice suffered poisoning from gas attacks, and that he participated in the occupation of Germany after the war. But those articles fail to state where those attacks occurred. The capital staff of the Austin American Statesman wrote that Slatton served 13 months in Europe with the 51st Telegraph Battalion of the Signal Corps, We do not know the details, but we're intent on finding out the full measure of his service and of his story. So if you know anyone who can share that with us, this is a story that is not yet over. We want to learn more. That's the symbol of those who provided telegraphy, command, control, and communications during the First World War. Those are American troops climbing up recently erected telephone poles. Here's Charles after he's returned from the war, wearing his 1920s headwear, participating in public service. Governor Allred, another Great War veteran, appointed Slatton as a justice of the Fourth Court of Appeals in San Antonio. He did so well that he had to be promoted. Supreme Court of Texas appointed Slatton as a commissioner of the Texas Supreme Court Commission of Appeals. Slatton lobbied leaders and members of the Order of Railroad Telegraphers, his brothers in arms in some instances, to support the ballot measure to expand the Texas Supreme Court from 3 members to 9 at meetings in Houston in 1944, and they succeeded. Joined the Texas Supreme Court when his own brother telegraphers supported the winning side of that issue in 1945. And so here we find the court helpers finally got the promotion that they seek, as celebrated in headlines of the time. Charles Slatton looks out at you. We should look back at him and say, thank you for your service. You honored us well, and we honor you. This was a war I just ask you to think about. It was a brutal war of new technology. Here, flamethrowers make their appearance on the left-hand side. On the right, tanks. But that's not the full measure of the story. It's of old technology, too. The most deadly weapon in the First World War was artillery. It accounted for 75% of soldiers who died. The second was the machine gun. The third was the rifle. The fourth was poison gas, giving the most horrible of deaths imaginable. The fifth consisted of bayonets and knives, edged weapons. But the sixth, and this is the true measure of the brutality of the fighting that cost over 100,000 Americans their lives and millions of French and German and English, Belgians, people from all over the world. The sixth deadliest weapon in the First World War was the trench club. A club of the kind you'd expect to find in a prehistoric deposit, but often wrapped in barbed wire or spiked, like these examples here. That's a measure of the true brutality of the First World War and of the courage of those who fought in it. And then, as you'll read Sharon's article, you'll find that women were in the voting booth too, fighting for their rights. Nellie Gray Robertson, first woman county attorney in Texas. The suffragettes who complained that we were suffering under a Kaiser Wilson. Hortense Sparks Ward, later Chief Justice of the first all-woman court in the United States in 1925. Here she was as a proponent of the Voting Rights Amendment to the Constitution that allowed women to vote for the first time, and she organized them to do so. So this was what they came back. They came back from making the world safe for democracy to improve democracy here in our own United States. They, and in the occupation zones, these are also the far one on the right, the TO, the Greetings from Noel Powell, and the General Pershing. Those are from my own family collections, from my grandfather's service in General Culver's unit. And this is what they returned to strengthen and expand the rule of law. Here we see all white males, but women went to war too, like Miss Stinson here. With her airplane, she's the one responsible for Stinson Field being a place where American Army Air Service pilots were trained, Catherine Stinson, and African Americans too, who came from Texas, trained at Camp Logan, but fought in France and received the Croix de Guerre from the French, who were grateful for their service. So it was a war to make the world safe for democracy, and one of the people who carried that message through was Dan Moody, our governor, that Judge Davidson will tell you about.
My job is to talk about the 3 governors that served Texas in the Great War, but before I do, I'm second affirmative rebuttal to those of you that were on debate in high school. I have a couple things to say. About Justice Gordon Simpson, he was allowed to come home from World War II to serve on the Texas Supreme Court, and he had served on the Texas Supreme Court for a year and a half when he got a letter from the Army ordering him to report to Dachau to write the appellate opinions reviewing Nuremberg trial convictions. And he dismissed charges against the non-coms, the non-commissioned officers, sergeants and corporals that did the shooting at Malmedy, and he ordered the death penalty to the officers. But if he can be recalled to military service, it can happen to any of you. Actually, I know of a judge, a state district judge in Minnesota that got a letter 15 years ago ordering him to report to Bosnia to sit in the war crimes trials. So it can happen to you any day. The second thing I want to tell you about is W. St. John Garwood. He was former Chief Justice Joe Greenhill's all-time favorite judge. And here's why. When Justice Greenhill became an associate justice of this court, the building wasn't air-conditioned. Judge Garwood, being a man of some means, bought a window unit for his office because he could afford it. When he was leaving the court, he went to the junior judge on the court, who was Joe Greenhill, and said, "I'll sell you my window unit for $25. And Greenhill said, "That's a whole lot on my salary, but I'll do it." And Greenhill's office became everybody's favorite place to hang out. Justice Greenhill told me that story. My job is to tell you about the three governors that served during the Great War. And I'll do it in the order in which they served. The first was Dan Moody. Dan had a wonderful career doing all sorts of things. And he was a captain in the Texas State Guard shortly after the beginning of the war. And they performed an important function because while the Texas soldiers were being trained to be sent over there, there was still fighting going on in Mexico, and the Texas State Guard patrolled the border. He tried to enlist, but because his mother was an invalid and his father was dead, the Army suggested that he stay at home and take care of his mother. He did that for a while, but then he accepted a demotion from being a captain in the Texas State Guard to being a private in the United States Army. He was in training at Camp Pike in Arkansas, probably being trained by future Justice, whichever one was in Arkansas. He was probably being trained by him. Yes, Few Brewster, when the war ended. But he stepped up and he served. During his campaign for governor against Miriam Ferguson, he made a big point she made a point to say that you didn't serve in the war, and he said, "I proudly did," and showed the fact that he protected the southern border, and then he reported with a demotion to private. That's military service. Miriam Ferguson, by the way, when he moved into the governor's mansion, it's traditional for the governor to leave a marked passage in the Bible that's in the governor's mansion for the incoming governor to read. Dan Moody at the time was 34 years old. Miriam Ferguson was considerably older. The passage left was from the Book of Kings. The people have named a boy to lead them. Not gracious. As Williamson County District Attorney after World War I, he fought the Ku Klux Klan and got convictions in Williamson County, which was the center of activity of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas. As Attorney General, he fought corruption in Texas government, especially in the office of the governor, the Fergusons. As governor, he jump-started the Texas Highway Program, building more roads for less money than the Fergusons had. And by the way, he also, you saw that he named future Judge Christian to be on the Board of Pardons. That was because the Fergusons were their own Board of Pardons, and it was popularly believed at the time that if you bought a horse from Governor Ferguson, your son could ride home from the penitentiary on that horse. Our next next governor is Governor James Allred. He had two older brothers serving in the military, and he didn't have to go. At the time the war broke out, he was a freshman at Rice University in Houston, working his way through Rice. It was free tuition, but he did have to eat. Working his way through Rice, working at a gas station. To make ends meet, he then went and got a job with the Customs Office in El Paso, which made him draft exempt. That didn't stop him. He went and enlisted in the Navy. Now, he was from Montague County, just south of the Red River. You can imagine just how much seawater he had ever seen when you're just south of the Red River. That didn't stop him. And the gentleman you see right under the U in Farragut, that's Jimmy Allred, and he was a seaman. Now, you never see the word Burr, and that was why, because when he showed up to enlist in the Navy, the guy asked, "What's your full name?" And he said, "James Burr V. Allred." He was named Burr after one uncle and V after another uncle whose name was V. No period, and you'll see we didn't put a period there. And the Navy guy said, "You have to have one middle name. What do you want?" And he said, V. So his name was James, his name became James V. Allred with no period after the word V. He was Wichita County District Attorney and ran for that office to be Attorney General of Texas. He then ran for governor of Texas in an unusual race. There were 3 people running, and they were all 3 from the same voting precinct in Wichita Falls, Texas. A really strange thing. After he served 4 years, President Roosevelt named him to be on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. President Roosevelt probably, in my opinion, talked him off of the Fifth Circuit, a lifetime job on the Fifth Circuit, to run for the U.S. Senate from Texas against Pappy O'Daniel. Another person in that race was Dan Moody, that we already talked about, and against the incumbent U.S. Senator Pappy O'Daniel. The person, Moody was eliminated in the first race. O'Daniel and Governor Allred ran in the runoff, and Allred lost, and O'Daniel won re-election by 2,232 votes. And I have heard it said that if Allred had been elected to the U.S. Senate in 42, it would have been him and not Harry Truman, who was FDR's running mate in the 44 election. And he could have been president, but for 2,232 votes. This is the picture of Jimmy Allred that's best known. You recognize the gentleman on the left and the right. Robert Cairo has written that LBJ gave hundreds of copies of this picture out to friends, but he airbrushed Governor Allred out of the middle. Now let's see if I can avoid crying. This is Captain Buford H. Jester. He was in his 2nd year at Harvard Law School when World War I broke out. He didn't wait to be drafted. He came back to Texas and enlisted in San Antonio. And he was part of that first camp, the first group of officers that went into Camp Leon Springs to learn how to lead other men. That's Buford Jester on the left. He trained, and he was eventually promoted within 6 weeks from being a private to being a captain. And I got a lot of detail on him because his family was good enough to lend me the letters that he wrote home to his mother during the war. Okay, I'm not going to cry. He was assigned, and everybody in his detachment were farmers from Oklahoma. He didn't even get Texas farmers. He got Oklahoma farmers and had to train them into a fighting unit. On the way over to the pond, the ship that he and his colleagues were on, he and his detachment was on, were attacked by a U-boat. He wrote his mother that things got a little hairy on the way over, but I can't really tell you why. They were attacked by a U-boat. And then he got shot at, and then, according to the history of the 90th Division, he was heavily gassed twice with mustard gas. Mustard gas is not something that you want to put on a hot dog. It is bad stuff. It does make you blind. It doesn't kill most people, but it contracts your passages. And we now know, because of studies that were done during the Iran-Iraq War of the mid-'80s, that are both peer-reviewed and allowed by Daubert standards, what's the other? The epidemiology standards, causes cardiac disease. He was also exposed to the flu, and half of the American casualties from World War I were because of the flu. Did he remember the people that he served with? Oh yes. When he was governor, at least 6 of his judicial appointments were people that had served in the 90th Division with him. He was in the Battle of Saint-Mihiel Salient, and when we go over to the reception, you will find the award that he was given for his participation and bravery in the Saint-Mihiel Salient battle in September of 1918. That's the medal. You'll see the original over there. By the way, when Captain Jester got off the boat, he was given this. This is a letter. The embossed stationery says Windsor Castle, thanking him for coming over because he was an officer, and it's signed at the bottom, George R.I. That is George Rex Imperator, also known as King George V of England. And this is the original note to Captain Jester when he arrived. So he was exposed lightly to the flu on the way back. So think of all he survived during the war. An incredible story of incredible bravery. And then after the war, was he a leader? Oh yeah. He started the Farm to Market Road program, paving thousands of miles of it. Farmers get their goods to city. My favorite Farm to Market Road, to those of you from Houston, is Farm to Market Road 1099, which we know as Westheimer Road. Not many goods go there that way. He adopted the first school finance system in Texas history and gave the school teachers of Texas a 15% pay raise, and the school finance system enabled schools to be built so that when the baby boomers after the war reached kindergarten and first grade, they had schools to go to, which they wouldn't have but for the Jester program. And he reformed Texas prisons again. He was gassed. He was blinded, and we now know that mustard gas leads to cardiac attack. Governor Jester died 30 years after the war at the age of 58. We're joined here today by his daughter, Joanne Berry. Ms. Berry, thank you to the Jester family for your service. I don't have time, and nor did I frankly study the entirety of the state bar's record in the Great War. I did a survey of Houston lawyers, at least 63 that we know of fought in the war. The firm of Baker and Botts had one gentleman who was sent over the lines every night, on moonless nights, through no man's land to look and try to survey the food levels, arms levels, and readiness levels of the Germans and bring a prisoner back if he could. And he did so every time, and whose name was James A. Baker, Jr. And there were others, and I could go on and on. Calvin Garwood, W. St. John's brother, was a legion. And many lawyers from around the state did the same. We just don't know them all. However, lest we forget, this gentleman is named John R. Burkett. He was a captain. He was a solo practitioner in Houston. He died a week before the armistice at the age of 25. He gave his life, and he was a lawyer from Texas that did that. We all owe him and Captain Jester and all the people that we honor here today a whole bunch for democracy and for making the world a little safer for us all. I want to again thank this court for this ceremony. You honor them. You honor your court's history by doing this. And with that, we have two more speakers. You want to? Brian, as you heard, is the grandson of Justice Griffin. Come on up. We have a response from the two from the two groups of people. You will be speaking on behalf of the justices.
I'm Brian Garner, Justice Meade F. Griffin's grandson. My father, his son-in-law, is here, Dr. Gary Garner, and Justice Griffin's great-granddaughter, Caroline, my daughter, as well as two other grandsons, because my grandfather put five brothers through high school and college, the Thomas brothers, and we're joined today by Tommy Thomas and Lewis Thomas. So thank you all for joining me. First of all, I want to say what a remarkable and impressive thing it is that the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society is commemorating the service of the 9 justices honored here today. And a big thank you to the Supreme Court itself for holding this special session of the court. The ingenuity and effort that have gone into both this ceremony and the journal articles about the justices are extraordinary. On behalf of all the descendants of the honorees, I think we owe a hearty round of applause to David Furlow, Judge Davidson, and all the organizers of this splendid event. The justices honored here had unique paths that led them into World War I. They were men of great intelligence, patriotism, and bravery. Their service to our nation helped shape the lives of all who have followed. For the descendants of Justices Brewster, Christian, Culver, Foley, Garwood, Griffin, Hamilton, Simpson, and Slatton, I can say most sincerely that we're awed by our ancestors' achievements and gratified that they're remembered by more than just their families. Justice Griffin, whom my brothers and I knew as Papa, was proudest of his military service after World War II, when he played the role of chief drafter of the rules of criminal procedure for Nazi war crimes. He based those rules principally on what were then the Texas Rules of Criminal Procedure. But that responsibility and that of Supreme Court Justice lay far in the future in 1917 when he was a 23-year-old law student at UT. It was then that the United States declared war on Germany, and the American industrial system, which was organized for peace, was suddenly turned into a nationwide munitions plant. We shouldn't forget that the Great War occasioned severe disruptions in the lives not only of the soldiers, but also of their families. When the time came to volunteer, young Meade Griffin was under pressure from his family in Tulia to return home from Austin to help his father on their Panhandle farm in the heart of the Dust Bowl. He was torn. But I should let him tell it in his own voice. In 1972, at his home here in Austin, he recorded recollections of his life on 7 long reel-to-reel audio tapes. Here is the segment dealing with his acceptance into the First Officers Training Camp as he recalled it at the age of 78. He recounts how reluctant he was at 23 and how guilty he felt for that reluctance. But let's hear him tell it. By the way, you have a handout. I meant the justices need a handout. May I approach the bench? He had a West Texas accent typical of the turn of the 20th century, and I think you're going to find it easier if you read along to make out what he's saying. But this is an accent you don't often hear much today. Here he is.
So, World War I came on, first paper, about 7 papers, I think 1917, and the United States government decided they were going to have to train some officers. They had about less than 7,500 officers and less than 200,000 men, and they knew they were going to have about 2 or 3 million men and 200,000 or 300,000 officers. So they set up 10 training camps over in the United States, and set up major up here to interview those who wanted to go. Well, I didn't go right at first, but we knew they were coming for a week or so ahead of time, and I heard my people had moved out to Tulia in the meantime, and my father had just started large-scale wheat farming. He was farming 640 acres, which was large-scale for those days, and tractors were just beginning to come in, and he saw how the advantage and the economic advantage of using those tractors on that level country out there in the plain. So he and mother wrote me, I'm young the son. They wrote me, didn't want me going on here. Well, they said, we're going to have to throw something for everybody to eat. You come on back here and go in with your father in this farming business. And the first week the major was here, I didn't go. And then by Lord, we just got I guess the every morning when I'd shave and comb my hair, I hadn't had it all day. I'd just say to myself, you yellow, bellied, charity, so-and-so, you're not going to stay out of that world. Your country needs you. And about the third morning, I talked to myself like that, went on down there and to be examined and was accepted. And
Patriotism is pretty much out of fashion today. We all remember that Samuel Johnson said that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. Too many of us forget that he was disparaging scoundrels, not patriotism. Mark Twain provided better context. He said, "In the beginning of a change, the patriot is a scarce man, and brave and hated and scorned. When his cause succeeds, the timid join him, for then it costs nothing to be a patriot." Our 9 honorees today were at the beginning of a change, and they were scarce men and brave. They succeeded. They were patriots. 5 years before he died, Justice Griffin sent his 3 Garner grandsons a book about World War I and the first officers' training camp. He inscribed it in 1969 at the height of the Vietnam War. In the inscription, he wrote, quote, "I am proud to have been part of this group of patriotic citizens who served in World War I, and I trust that you may get some thrills of patriotism for our great nation. Do not let anyone persuade you that you have no duty to defend it in its time of need." The men we honor here today made history. They clarified Texas law, they made Texas history, and they contributed to American history. On behalf of all the descendants, I thank the Texas Supreme Court and the Historical Society for remembering their unique contributions.
May it please the court. I'm honored to be asked to address you today. My role is to speak for the families of the 3 governors of Texas who served during World War I. As you heard, I'm here for the Moody, Allred, and Jester families, and it's because of the last name that I was asked to speak. My grandfather was Governor Buford H. Jester, and Jester is my middle name. At the outset, I want to thank the Supreme Court of Texas and the Supreme Court Historical Society for the idea of the commemoration. When a 17-year-old freshman at Rice University named James Burr V. Allred signed up to join the Navy, he certainly had no idea we would be here today remembering his service, but we are. When young Captain Moody in the Texas National Guard resigned to start at the bottom of the United States Army, he might have not have thought it was something to be honored, but it was. When my grandfather was poisoned with mustard gas, yet refused to leave his men under his command, he probably did not think it to be praiseworthy, since he was just doing his part. But it was worthy of praise and commendation. Today we remember and honor these men and the many men and women who were their compatriots, for which I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I also want to thank you on a personal level. I knew that my grandfather had served in the Great War and had been at First Officers Training Camp with the man who would later become both my other grandfather and Adjutant General of the National Guard of Texas under Buford, General Carey Lee Berry, but I knew little more than that of his World War I service. As you've heard, he died in office at the age of 56, while my mother was just a 19-year-old college girl, much like Governor Abbott's daughter Audrey today. So I only knew stories, but never the man. My father took my brother Jim to the site of Granddad's training ground there at Camp Leon Springs, where they found a spent .30-06 shell from that time, but that was as close as we kids ever felt to him. My mother, his middle child Joanne, had heard little about his service. Like most of the war's veterans, he talked very little about his experiences in Europe, and my mother has had very little to pass on to me. I'm not alone in this regard. The Allred and the Moody families, when contacted, had very little to pass on about their ancestors' war records. However, my family did have several boxes of old photographs and papers, which had been for decades in my parents' hot Houston attic. When Judge Davidson contacted me for possible World War I photos of my grandfather, my sister Janet, my mother, and I finally had the impetus to start digging through them. Among the campaign-era photographs of Hollywood actors like Jane Russell and John Bowles, you know, the friend of the girlfriend of Dr. Frankenstein in Frankenstein, all stumping for granddad, they also turned out to include transcribed versions of his eloquent letters to his parents back in Corsicana throughout the war. All of his letters, and he wrote a lot. Particularly touching to me was reading the 25-year-old's thoughts on joining up versus waiting to be drafted in 1917, his excitement over his promotion from private to captain during the 6-week training course, where he was one of these 6-week wonders, his training for trench warfare and the use of gas masks, apparently ineffective, his wonder at the graciousness and warmth of the French villagers who sheltered him. He gained weight, and his awe at spending Easter morning at St. Peter's in Rome while on leave. He even asked about that cute little girl from Texarkana whom he'd met before shipping off, who later became First Lady of Texas. But I most loved reading his repeated mentions of his immense pride in his men, Company D, which I just learned today included Justice Christian, his dedication to ensuring their safety and good training, setting a good example for them, and filling them with esprit. They were known as the Singing Company. I think all foretold his leadership as governor. It's no surprise that the men of Company D attended Buford's inauguration and hoisted their former commander on their shoulders. In other words, the work leading up to this ceremony brought my family and me closer to my grandfather, a man I never had the privilege of meeting. I'm hopeful that all of us here today have learned from the stories of the young men who answered the call to defend freedom. If we do that, this event will be one of both remembrance and significance. I hope as well that the accomplishments of Governors Moody, Allred, and Jester can now be seen through the prism of their experiences and leadership during the Great War. Thank you again for the honor to address you today.
May it please the court. My name is Warren Harris. I'm a past president of the Society, and I've been asked to make a few remarks today about the works of the Society's fellows. The fellows of the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society are our highest level donors. The generosity of the fellows allows the Society to undertake projects that educate the bar and the public on the third branch of government and the history of our Supreme Court. A major educational project of the fellows is Taming Texas, which is a judicial civics program for 7th grade Texas history classes that puts judges and lawyers in classrooms. The fellows' support has allowed us to produce a series of books for this project. The first book, Taming Texas, How Law and Order Came to the Lone Star State, was published in 2016, and the second book, published last year, is entitled Law and the Texas Frontier. You can find free copies of electronic versions of both of these books on the Society's website dedicated to the project, which is at www.tamingtexas.org. We're pleased to report that the third book in the series is nearing completion. The latest book is entitled The Chief Justices of Texas and contains interesting stories about the 27 Chief Justices of the Texas Supreme Court. We would like to thank Chief Justice Nathan Hecht, Justice Paul Green, and the entire court for their support of this important project. Being in the classroom and teaching students about the rule of law is one of the most important things that we as lawyers can do to educate the next generation. We've partnered with the Houston Bar Association to take the Taming Texas project into schools across Houston. In the last 3 years, HBA volunteers taught the program to nearly 20,000 7th graders in Houston. And we're glad to report that the Taming Texas project has expanded to Dallas, and the Dallas Bar Association is now sending lawyers and judges in the classroom to teach students in Dallas. And we plan to expand the program to Austin next year. On behalf of the Society, I want to thank all of the fellows for their generous support of our educational programs such as Taming Texas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Acting Chief Justice Green. On behalf of the current and past members of the court, thank you to the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society and all of today's presenters and organizers for putting together this very important and impressive event. I was especially moved to hear Mr. Garner and Ms. Berry speak about their grandfathers. I myself am not a direct blood descendant of any veterans of the Great War, but in a very real way, we are all their descendants because we have inherited what they left for us, what they defended for us, what they preserved for us through their selfless service and sacrifice. We are descendants of veterans because we are their heirs. And as their heirs, we are stewards of their legacy. We fulfill that duty of stewardship by honoring their memory through efforts like this ceremony. But more importantly, we fulfill that duty by following their example. It's my hope that today's event inspires all of us to rededicate ourselves to standing up for the values these brave ancestors fought to defend, not only in their service as soldiers and sailors, but in the lives they led before and after the war, as lawyers, judges, public servants, and ordinary citizens. We should be happy to follow their lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Brown, and thank you to the Society for putting on a remarkable program. Obviously, quite a bit of work has gone into this, and I'm very grateful for that. The court is as well. I want to make sure everybody understands that there is a reception to follow immediately after this is over at the Texas Law Center, and many of the archived documents and items from the period will be there, and you're not going to want to miss this, I'm told. It's really quite something to see. So please do that. And now we'll call upon the clerk of the court to adjourn the court.
All right.